I accidentally made Harry Potter's butterbeer due to a defect called diacetyl, and to be completely honest, I thought it was delicious. I loved it, but this is supposed to be an American IPA, not a pint of movie theater butter, so unfortunately I removed it, but I did so using a really cool beer hack that I will tell you about in this video. Also, I dry hopped this beer in a bucket, which prompted the internet brew police to say, it's like you don't even care anymore. Well, you know what? Perhaps we never did, but perhaps it doesn't matter, because if you dry hop it the way I did, your beer will turn out just fine, and I'll explain why and how to do that in this video as well. But before we get into all of that, let's get this beer started. The grain bill for this IPA is simple. I was really focusing more on the hops, so I just went with 13 pounds of Southern Select 2-row. This is Riverbend Malt, a local maltster here in Asheville, a product that we're about to start carrying, so check out our website for details. Anyway, before mashing, I ran the grains through our grain mill, which I dialed into a gap of 0.05 inches. This crush gives a really nice balance because the grains are crushed just enough to break open the kernel so you can get the sugars out, but not so much that they turn into powder and jam up the system. Once the grains were milled, I placed the grain basket into the kettle with the cap attached. This is an important little step. It keeps the stray grains from sneaking down the overflow pipe while mashing in. This can make the difference between a smooth brew day and clogging everything up. So don't forget that. With the basket in place, I set the mash temperature to 156 degrees and programmed the timer for 60 minutes using the system's built-in controller. This particular mash temperature gives the finished beer a fuller body, which is really helpful for balancing out the big hop character of an American IPA, which again, this is what this beer is. It is a good idea to stir in the mash when you first add the grain to avoid the creation of dough balls, which are clumps of grains that don't get fully converted into sugar if they're left alone. Stirring also helps the heat distribute evenly at the start of the mash, ensuring that all of the starches break down properly and evenly. So the grain basket does come with an overflow screen, which I inserted after removing the cap and after mashing in. This screen keeps the grains contained within the basket in case the liquid rises during the mashing period. Also, the overflow pipe lets wort flow safely down the malt pipe back down into the bottom of the kettle without taking grains along with it, which also prevents your system from dry firing. It's the really small details like this that I really like about this system, which makes it easy to use and hard to screw things up for silly people like me. Next, I added the recirculation arm and turned the pump on so the wort would evenly distribute through the grain bed. You can adjust the flow using the ball valve at the top of the arm, which I would recommend. Once the mash is complete, pull the grain basket, let it drain, and then just dump the grain into a compost bin or something like that. This is what I did just as it started to dump rain outside, which meant it was also a pretty nice day to be inside brewing beer.
Bro. Oh no.
Anyway, I set the system to a 60-minute boil, and while I waited for the boil to begin, I rinsed off the grain basket. With this system, I like to put the lid on at the start of the boil because it helps the water come to a boil faster. You can also use the lid during the mash, dealer's choice. Anyway, the boil is where all of my hop additions come into play, and this is, after all, an American IPA, so it means I'll be adding quite a bit of hops. Here is the exact schedule. At 60 minutes, I added half an ounce of sultana, tomato for bittering. At 15 minutes, I added a 1/4 ounce each of Amarillo and Cascade. And at 5 minutes, I added another 1/4 ounce of Amarillo and Cascade. I also added a whirlpool tablet because I want this beer to be fairly clear when it's done conditioning. Part of the reason for brewing this beer was actually to test out a new whirlpool arm, which I did by chilling the wort down to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, tossing in an ounce each of cryopop and sultana, and whirlpooling for 20 minutes. The balance of early and late hop additions in this recipe provides the bitterness you'd expect in an American IPA and some really powerful aroma. After the whirlpool, I chilled the wort down the rest of the way to yeast pitching temp, which is going to be somewhere under 70 degrees Fahrenheit, but I didn't actually pitch the yeast. I've been doing a new trick with the wort and the yeast, which I think produces better fermentation results. It works out like this. After chilling, I actually transferred the wort to a clean and sanitized fermentation bucket using the mash arm. And instead of pitching the yeast right away, I just put the bucket of wort in the yeast packet in the fridge overnight to chill down exactly to the temp I wanted for fermentation, which for me was something like 66 degrees Fahrenheit. This allowed me to get things a bit cooler than I would have using the immersion chiller alone. It wants to stall out at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It also ensures that the yeast and the wort are exactly the same temp when the yeast is pitched, which the yeast scientists will tell you is important. And doing it this way eliminates any type of temperature shock because everything will be exactly the same temperature. So yeah, the next day I came in and pitched 1 pack of Safel US 05. I put the lid back on and then I put it in the fridge to start fermentation. All right, now let's address the dry hopping in a bucket. First, there are better ways to do this. Our fermentation keg being one of them. Using something like that allows dry hop additions to be made with virtually no exposure to ambient air, which could oxidize your beer. However, if you do it right, you can also use a regular old bucket. To dry hop with the bucket, just make sure that fermentation is still active. That is the key point. My dry hop additions were a ½ ounce each of Amarillo and Cascade and 1 ounce each of Cryopop and Sultana. We made a short about this and a few people weighed in, kind of telling us we were doing it wrong. A few others asked questions about it. Listen, not everyone has the money and the space for a sealed fermenter and a hop dropper, and that's why I'm using a bucket here. But I'm also doing it to show you that if you do it right, you don't need to worry about oxidation. The yeast will either consume or expel any oxygen that enters the fermenter if you add the hops during active fermentation, so it's actually not a big deal. So I let the fermenter sit in the temperature controlled chamber for at least a week total. I then took it out and let it sit at room temperature, which is easily above 70 degrees for a few days. Then I cold crash it by dropping the temp to 33 degrees, and I transferred the beer to a keg along with some gelatin. Gelatin is going to help clarify the beer. And like I said, my first impressions of this beer after it was all carved up was that it was amazing. There was definitely a mystery flavor in there that wasn't necessarily hops or grain, but I was digging it. What I was mostly concerned about, or I should say curious about, was whether or not the beer was at all oxidized. And the answer to that was, to me, a resounding no. I don't think it was, and neither did JW, the owner of our local homebrew shop. Here was his reaction.
I have one question for you.
Yes.
Sip that beer and tell me if it's oxidized.
No, I wouldn't say it's oxidized.
Emmett and I are pretty bad at tasting, just to be completely honest. So since we were in the presence of a very experienced taster, JW, the next question was, were there any other defects that he noticed? Which I only kind of half wanted him to answer. Anyway, the answer to that question came as a surprise.
It's a nice beer. It's got a little bit of diacetyl in the nose. You could detect it. It's not like enough to like have the slickness and the like real like heavy butter vibes that you can get sometimes, but it does have just a touch, which is probably from when you dry hopped it in the hop creep, especially if you dry hopped it warm.
Okay, that's not what I was hoping for. But upon tasting it again, I realized that he was right. The beer did have a slight butter taste. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there. And like I said, I didn't notice it because I actually really liked it. In the past, I've tasted beer that was absolutely loaded with diacetyl, and I loved it. So I don't know, maybe I'm just weird. Though I'm not sure why this beer contained it, because I definitely did a diacetyl rest, and the beer 100% sat in the fermenter long enough, so it was done fermenting. Maybe, just maybe, the commenters on our dry hop video were right, and exposing the beer to oxygen while transferring it into the keg actually kicked off fermentation again. I'll leave the door open for that. In either case though, this is actually a defect that can be fixed. All I had to do was follow the following process. I took the keg out of the kegerator. I warmed it back up to room temp. I added some dry yeast, and then I just let it sit for another week. This fresh yeast consumed the diacetyl and cleaned the beer up. And here is the final tasting.
It's not as clear as it was. I kind of figured that would happen because I used Kvike. It's kind of quick acting yeast. I just wanted to get this project done. I don't know if that was the best choice, but that's what I used. So it also may have like a citrus vibe that it didn't have before. The question is though, is the butter still there? And do we care?
No butter on my nose or taste.
Yeah,
I like that it smells sweeter than it is. The bitterness is perfect.
I'm a butter guy. I kind of like the butter better.
What is it, Paula Deen with the butter? It's Paula Deen riding a stick of butter. We can throw her up here.
Okay, we're good.
It's really good,
I
seriously.
Learned a lesson on this one. Thanks, JW. Have friends that are smarter than you are.
JW is smart.
Yeah, he's a smart guy.
Smarter than Kyle.
Smarter than Kyle. I like it.
Pretty
Yeah,
good.
I think maybe more universally likable beer.
So it was a bit of a journey, but at the end, we ended up with a really nice, crispy, well-balanced American IPA that I'm really happy with.